The world knew Ace Frehley walked away from Kiss in December 1982, but nobody knew why. Gene Simmons gave interviews. Paul Stanley wrote his version in books. But Ace himself stayed quiet, letting the rumors fill the silence, until a forgotten tape surfaced in a dusty archive room 23 years later, and everything changed. That tape was recorded in the summer of 1981, 6 months before Ace's final performance with Kiss. Electric Lady Studios, Studio A, 3 in the morning. The engineer had gone home. The rest of the band was in different cities, and Ace Frehley, alone with a bottle of Jack Daniels and a microphone, decided to tell the truth. Not for an album, not for an interview, just for himself. Or so he thought. What he said into that microphone would remain hidden until 2005, buried beneath hundreds of other session reels in a storage facility in Manhattan. When it finally emerged, the words on that tape revealed a man caught between two identities, and a choice that would define the rest of his life. Before we dive into this untold story, if you're someone who lived through the golden age of rock and roll, who remembers when Kiss ruled the arenas and Ace Frehley was the coolest guitarist on the planet, subscribe now because we're about to take you behind the makeup, behind the myth, and into the mind of Space Ace himself during the most turbulent period of his life. Summer 2005. Tom Phillips, a studio archivist at Electric Lady Studios, was cataloging decades of forgotten session tapes in a basement storage room. Box after box of unmarked reels, most of them abandoned projects that would never see daylight. But Phillips was a music obsessive, the kind of guy who had seen Kiss 4 times in the 70s, who still owned the original pressing of Ace's solo album on vinyl. So when he found a reel marked only with a date, August 7, 1981, and the handwritten initials AF, his hands started shaking. The tape had been stored improperly. The humidity had warped some of the oxide coating, and Phillips wasn't sure if it would even play. He carefully threaded it onto one of the studio's vintage Studer machines and pressed play. What came through the monitors was barely audible at first, just tape hiss and ambient hum. Then a throat clearing, a long exhale, and Ace Frehley's unmistakable voice, rougher than usual, slurred slightly but coherent, speaking directly into the microphone like he was talking to an old friend. The monologue lasted 47 minutes. Phillips listened to the entire thing without moving. When it was over, he sat in silence for a long time, trying to process what he'd just heard. Because this wasn't a demo session or a rehearsal. It was a confession. A raw, unfiltered stream of consciousness from a man who was falling apart and knew it. Ace talked about the makeup, about Gene and Paul, about the drugs and alcohol and crushing loneliness of being famous. He talked about things he'd never said in public, would never say in public. And he talked about a decision he was planning to make that would end his time with Kiss forever. But here's what made the discovery so remarkable. This tape wasn't supposed to exist. Session logs from Electric Lady Studios in 1981 showed no record of Ace booking time there. The engineer on duty that night, Rick Mendez, had no memory of Ace coming in. The tape had somehow bypassed the studio's archival system entirely, as if someone had deliberately hidden it. For 24 years, Ace Frehley's most intimate confession had been sitting in a cardboard box in a basement, waiting to be found. Phillips knew he had something extraordinary, but he also knew this was private, maybe too personal to share. Through careful inquiries, he eventually got a message to Ace's management, explaining what he'd found and asking what should be done with it. Ace's response took 3 months to arrive. The message was brief, handwritten on personal stationery. It said simply, I remember that night. Keep the tape safe. I'm not ready to talk about it yet. That was 2005. Ace wouldn't be ready to talk about it for another 13 years. To understand what drove Ace to that studio in the dead of night, you have to understand where Kiss was in the summer of 1981. The band had been together for 8 years. They'd conquered the world, sold millions of albums, become cultural icons. But behind the makeup and pyrotechnics, the cracks were showing. Deep, irreparable cracks. The previous year had been brutal. The Unmasked album had underperformed. The tour had been chaotic, and tensions within the band had reached a breaking point. Ace's drinking was getting worse. His interest in recording new material had evaporated. During sessions, he'd show up late, unprepared, sometimes barely functional. Gene Simmons had started bringing in session guitarists to cover Ace's parts, a humiliation that Ace felt acutely but seemed unable to address. But there was more to it than professional friction. Ace Frehley had always been the outlier in Kiss. While Gene and Paul focused on building an empire, on merchandising and world domination, Ace just wanted to play guitar. He loved the music, loved performing, but he hated the business side. The Space Ace character, which had seemed so liberating in the beginning, had become a prison. Everywhere he went, people expected the character, not the man. Paul Daniel Frehley from the Bronx had disappeared beneath the silver makeup and the mystique. And then there was the solo album. In 1978, all 4 Kiss members had released solo records simultaneously. But Ace's album had done something unexpected. It had outsold the others. His version of New York Groove had become a legitimate hit, climbing to number 13 on the Billboard Hot 100. For the first time, Ace Frehley had proven he didn't need Kiss to be successful. He could stand on his own. That realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. By the summer of 1981, Ace was caught in an impossible situation. He was creatively unfulfilled within Kiss, drowning in substances he used to numb the dissatisfaction, yet financially dependent on the band's touring income. His marriage was struggling. His relationship with his children was strained. The pressure was crushing him, and he had no one to talk to about it. That's when he walked into Electric Lady Studios at 3 a.m. with a bottle of whiskey and an idea. According to fragmented memories Rick Mendez later shared, Ace slipped him $500 in cash and asked for an hour alone in Studio A. No witnesses, no documentation. Mendez agreed, locked up, and went home. He never asked what Ace was planning to do in there. In the rock and roll world of 1981, you didn't ask questions when someone wanted privacy in a studio. When Ace finally allowed portions of the tape to be shared in 2018, during the promotional cycle for his autobiography, the world got to hear what he'd said that night. Not the full 47 minutes, but carefully selected excerpts. Even those brief segments were startling in their honesty. The tape begins with Ace adjusting the microphone and taking a long drink. You can hear the bottle clinking against the glass table. Then he starts talking, his voice low and contemplative. He talks about the early days of Kiss, about the excitement of building something from nothing, about the first time they played Madison Square Garden. There's genuine affection when he remembers those moments, nostalgia for when everything felt possible, and the band felt like a brotherhood. But then the tone shifts. Ace starts talking about the makeup, about how it had started as a gimmick and gradually become a cage. He describes the physical discomfort of wearing it for hours during shows, the way it made him feel disconnected from his own face, his own identity. More than that, he talks about the psychological weight of maintaining the Space Ace persona, Fans expected him to be mysterious, aloof, cool. They didn't want to see Paul Daniel Frehley, the working-class kid from the Bronx. They wanted the guitar hero with the smoking guitar and spaceman boots. The most gut-wrenching part comes about 20 minutes in. Ace's voice breaks slightly as he talks about his children, about how they'd started to look at him differently as Kiss got bigger. He describes a moment when his daughter asked him why he wore clown makeup to work, and he couldn't find an adequate answer. She was too young to understand theatrical rock. She just saw her father covering his face with paint and wondered why. That question haunted him more than any criticism from the press or conflict with the band. What Ace said next became the most quoted portion when it was finally released. He said, "I think I've been playing a character for so long that I forgot who I actually am. When I take off the makeup at night, I look in the mirror and I don't recognize the guy looking back at me. He's tired. He's angry. He's scared. And he's not Space Ace. He's just some guy who made some choices and now he's stuck with them. And the worst part is, nobody wants to know that guy. They want the character. They always want the character." Those words resonated with an entire generation of Kiss fans because they revealed something simultaneously obvious and shocking. Behind the mystique, there was a human being struggling with the same existential questions that plague everyone. The tape made it impossible to see Ace as just a guitar-slinging rock god. He was a person, flawed, conflicted, vulnerable. But the tape didn't just contain philosophical musings. Ace talked about conversations with his accountant regarding the financial ramifications of leaving Kiss. He mentioned demo recordings he'd been making at home, sketches of songs that didn't fit the Kiss sound but felt more authentic to his musical instincts. He referenced a phone call with another famous guitarist who had left a successful band and gone solo, who had encouraged Ace to do the same. Though Ace never named the guitarist, most people speculated it was either Peter Frampton or Eddie Van Halen. Most significantly, Ace talked about a conversation with Jeanette, his wife at the time. He described sitting in their Connecticut home one evening, looking out at the trees, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace he never felt in Kiss. Jeanette had asked him a simple question. "Are you happy?" And Ace realized he couldn't answer honestly. He'd deflected, made a joke, changed the subject, but the question lingered. Was he happy? Was any of this worth it if he was miserable? The tape ends abruptly, mid-sentence. Ace is talking about the upcoming tour schedule, about how exhausted he feels, and then there's a loud click as the recording stops. It's unclear whether he ran out of tape or simply decided he'd said enough. Either way, the effect is jarring. What happened after that recording session is well documented. Ace continued with Kiss through the rest of 1981 and into 1982, but his heart wasn't in it. The music from the Elder album, released in November 1981, was a commercial disappointment. Ace barely participated in the recording. The subsequent tour was scaled back. The energy was gone. By fall 1982, the situation had become untenable. Ace was showing up to rehearsals drunk or not showing up at all. His performances were erratic. In December, during a meeting at a hotel in New York, Ace and the rest of Kiss had the conversation they'd been avoiding. According to Paul Stanley's later accounts, it was civil but final. Ace said he needed to step away. Gene and Paul didn't fight him on it. There was relief all around, mixed with sadness for what was ending. The official announcement came shortly after. The reasons given to the press were vague: creative differences, desire to pursue solo projects. All true, in a way. But none of it captured the deeper truth Ace had articulated on that secret tape 15 months earlier. He was leaving because he had to. Because the alternative was to keep disappearing into a character that no longer fit. The years following Ace's departure were turbulent. He formed Frehley's Comet, released albums that had moderate success, but never reached Kiss's commercial heights. His struggles with addiction continued, deepened, nearly killed him. There were arrests, failed relationships, moments that looked like rock bottom until an even deeper bottom appeared. The narrative around Ace during the 80s and 90s was often tragic, but that narrative was incomplete. Because while Ace was fighting his demons, he was also reclaiming his identity. Slowly, painfully, he was figuring out who Paul Daniel Frehley was beneath the Space Ace makeup. He was writing music that mattered to him, not music designed to fit a corporate strategy. He was building relationships with his children, trying to repair the damage that years of touring and addiction had caused. The Kiss reunion tours in the late 90s gave Ace a chance to revisit the character one more time, but with different perspective. He put on the makeup again, played the old songs, gave fans what they wanted. But now it felt like a choice rather than an obligation. He could step into Space Ace for a couple hours, enjoy the nostalgia and adrenaline, then take off the makeup and go back to being himself. The character no longer controlled him. When Tom Phillips reached out in 2005 about the discovered tape, Ace wasn't ready to confront it. The memories were too raw. But over the next decade, as he gained distance from the tumultuous Kiss years, his perspective shifted. He started to see that tape not as a document of weakness, but as evidence of a pivotal moment. It was the beginning of the end, but also the beginning of a new beginning. In 2018, during an interview for his autobiography, No Regrets, Ace publicly acknowledged the tape for the first time. He didn't release the full recording, but he shared excerpts and talked openly about the night he made it. The reaction from fans was overwhelmingly supportive. People who had loved Space Ace since the 70s were moved to hear the human being behind the persona speak honestly about his struggles. It created a new level of connection. What's most striking about the tape, listening to it now with hindsight, is how much self-awareness Ace possessed, even in his darkest moments. He knew he was drinking too much. He knew he was disconnected from the people who mattered. He knew the path was unsustainable. The tape proves Ace's eventual departure wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was the culmination of months, maybe years, of internal struggle. The tape was just the moment when he finally said it out loud. Today, Ace Frehley is in his 70s, still playing guitar, still touring occasionally, still connected to the music that defined his life. The Space Ace character is part of his history, something he can reference with affection and irony. But he's no longer trapped by it. He's found a way to be both the iconic guitarist from Kiss and Paul Frehley from the Bronx. The secret tape from 1981 stands as a testament to profound honesty in the midst of chaos. It captured a man at a crossroads, wrestling with impossible choices, trying to articulate feelings he could barely understand himself. The fact that we can now hear that struggle makes him more than a guitar hero. It makes him real. The tape reminds us that behind every iconic figure, every legendary performance, every unforgettable guitar solo, there's a human being with doubts and fears and dreams. Ace's secret recording didn't diminish his legend. It enriched it, added depth to a story we thought we already knew. For fans who have followed Ace's career across 5 decades, the tape is a gift. It lets us understand not just what he did, but why. It connects the dots between the triumphant guitar hero of the 70s and the weathered survivor of the 2000s. It shows us that the path from Space Ace to Paul Frehley wasn't a straight line. It was messy and complicated and human. And in the end, that's what makes Ace Frehley's story so compelling. Not the makeup or pyrotechnics or platinum albums, but the man who wore the makeup, who stood beneath the pyrotechnics, who created the albums. The man who, on one forgotten night in 1981, sat alone in a recording studio and dared to tell the truth. That tape, hidden for decades and rediscovered by chance, is proof that honesty always finds a way to surface. Ace Frehley's secret tape is more than a historical curiosity. It's a reminder that the most interesting stories are often the ones we tell ourselves when no one else is listening. And sometimes, if we're lucky, those stories survive long enough for others to hear them too.